Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our sixth installment of our webinar series, Leading Through Crisis, hosted by the Guelph Chamber of Commerce and the Lang School. My name is Shakiba Shayani, CEO at the Guelph Chamber. We're a not-for-profit member-driven organization where we advocate, connect, and convene on behalf of our members to foster economic prosperity. I'm so pleased that you could all join us today. If you haven't already, I kindly ask that you take a second and complete the poll that is up on your screens. This will help our panelists understand who exactly is in the audience today. We will also be posting polls throughout the webinar, and these will inform our speakers' content, so please take a moment to answer any you might see. Our webinar today will explore the critical questions related to sustainability in the post-COVID-19 business environment. We will take a deep dive into purposeful leadership and strategies required to pursue corporate sustainability in a time of crisis. Of course, a few housekeeping items before we get started. Feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. We will try and take questions after each speaker, as well as at the end of the webinar. We have enabled upvoting on questions, so if you see a question you would like answered, simply upvote it and we will try and address the most popular questions. Please also note that both of our panelists' PowerPoint presentations will be sent to you after the conclusion. So you can see we have some results of who's participating today. Quite a few small businesses, 37%, and then a mixed range between our medium and large businesses. So welcome to everyone. And it looks like we have quite a few not-for-profits, educational institution and government employees and businesses joining us. And it makes a lot of sense because we are talking about sustainability. Now I'd like to introduce our wonderful and esteemed experts. Dr. Rumina Dhalla is an associate professor at the Gordon S. Lang School of Business and Economics. Her main research interests are in organizational identity and their influence and implications for organizational strategies, sustainability, and corporate social responsibility. Dr. Dhalla currently teaches in the Lang MBA program and has taught at the Schulich School of Business. Chris Coulter is joining us as well. Chris is the CEO of GlobeScan and has 2 decades of experience providing evidence-based counsel in the areas of reputation, purpose, and sustainability. He is passionate about building trusted and recognized leadership for his clients. He's also a member of Sustainability's Council and is the chair of the Canadian Business for Social Responsibility. He's also a member of the new multinational subcommittee of B-Lab Standards Advisory Council. Chris is also a proud member of U of G alumni. I'm going to pass the mic to Chris first. Hi, Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Shakiba. Really good to be here, and wish we were at the Albion having this instead of virtually, but that will come one day. Yeah, so I'm honored to be able to be here and to share some of research that we've been doing through this time, which also I think has relevance to the COVID crisis and business response to it, but also more broadly to what leading companies are doing today and what they could be doing in the evolution. So I thought we'd talk about three different things today. One is review some research that we did in late March around how companies across the world have responded to the crisis. Secondly, talk a little bit about how you might evaluate the collective corporate business response to the crisis so far, and what does that mean for broader sustainability leadership? And then finally, we'll end with the evolution of corporate leadership over the last 2 decades, which I think gives us a flavor for where we might be going in the future. So this is some work that we did at GlobeScan in March, and we reviewed between January and end of March initiatives across the world that companies had committed to respond to the crisis. So we began looking at what happened in Asia early on, and then Europe and North America, but also Africa and Latin America. And together we wanted to understand collectively about these different actions. So these 202 corporate initiatives that we looked at in end of March feels quite a long time ago, but it'll give us a flavor of the initial responses that we sort of saw. And we categorize these 202 responses into 12 different types of initiatives, from donations to production, modifications to voluntary actions. And so there was a good, diverse set of actions that companies were taking from all different sectors across the world. And when we categorize those into a more consolidated set of actions, we noticed there was this interesting progression from business adaptation to more philanthropic type of activities, to more collaborative and complex responses, and finally to a more shared value framework on some of the work that these organizations were doing. And when we saw that time period between January and end of March across the world, there was two types of evolutions that were transpiring. One, to a more sophisticated, complicated approach to the response. Took time to kind of figure it out and drive it. And then secondly, just greater scale and ambition that was being viewed. And there was a momentum that we saw underpinning a lot of this. And examples across sectors, because sectors really did sometimes define the type of response that companies are doing. So in retail, for example, there was a focus on vulnerable populations, and in technology, there was all kinds of ways to support at-home working and virtualization, which we're all familiar with now quite a bit. And down the list, you could see little nuances and differentiations, the type of responses that were very much a part of the organization's capacity, competencies, and customer needs in many ways. So that was what was driving this quite substantially. And when we stepped back and asked in a survey of stakeholders across the world, how well do we think business responded in those early days, the response was positive, but not overwhelmingly so. And 46% of people across the world thought that companies were doing a pretty good job when it came to responding to the crisis and to societal needs. 36% gave an average rating, and only 17% thought it was poor. So the marks were positive. We would call it probably a B or a B plus overall, but it wasn't a home run across the board. Yet there is and has been an opportunity for certain companies to respond strongly and respond to some of the challenges around broad societal trust. So that was the context of what we picked up and what we're looking at, and by no means was it fully exhaustive. But then we stepped back and wanted to see how might we assess more systemically how businesses have been able to respond. And it's very difficult because in the midst of a crisis, it's a fight or flight reaction. And as we progress, we need to be a bit more thoughtful and a bit more strategic in how we're applying sustainability principles, corporate responsibility principles to respond not only to the crisis, but also the ongoing challenges and crises that we have, including the climate crisis, including the growing inequality crisis, as well as the health crisis that COVID presents. And so we wanted to look at a framework that we've been developing for many years that define, I think, quite significantly what good looks like and what corporate leadership looks like. And it has these 3 Ps. 1 P around purpose, which has to do with having a very clear, unifying vision, ideally a purpose statement, but an overarching organizing principle for how the organization comes to be and why it exists. And then within purpose also this idea of human leadership, executives, C-suite, CEOs being able to articulate and show empathy around these challenges and demonstrate their purpose in flesh and blood. The other P is performance, which has a bunch of different aspects, including a broad stakeholder-centric approach, and also trying to activate and respond through our existing business models, our products and services that we offer as organizations. And then also thinking beyond that constellation to bigger systemic challenges and changes, and can we deliver and support some of those. And then the final P is around participation, which has to do with internal and external engagement and that all-important aspect of collaboration. So I wanted to show a few best practices in each of these and then give a bit of a report card and how we see business collectively responding thus far to the challenges. So under the purpose banner, when it comes to unifying ideas and vision, we see that there are a number of companies that have really demonstrated and in line with their existing purpose. And the healthcare company GSK has a purpose of helping people live longer and better lives. And in that context, they responded very forcefully and dramatically across a whole range of different activities to deliver on that. In the executive leadership side, there are a number of different companies that were quite vocal, and CEOs and Loblaws in Canada with Galen Weston talking about the importance of frontline workers and supporting them and kind of getting through the challenges. And also in India, Chairman Mahindra Rise was a very thoughtful, optimistic, and calm voice from the business sector in the broader societal context. And those are important examples of purposeful leadership. When it comes to performance, there are also some best practices across a range of sectors. And when we were thinking of assessing how well companies address not only their employees or their customers, but also extend their responsibilities and responsiveness to other stakeholders, Lululemon is a great example of a company under real pressure as a retail organization, but they also saw that their ecosystem, including smaller yoga studios, were critical to support and get them through this crisis, as well as some of their other stakeholders. On activating products and services and brands, there's obviously a great response from a range of organizations, from hand sanitizers to ventilators, but 3M pushed very hard in some of their work around PPE products and drove them across the world, despite some of the challenges they had from President Trump. And then finally, systemic change, not only thinking today about the immediate responses, but also trying to align some of the actions towards bigger, more systemic challenges around the economy, the environment, and society. And there's a great example of My Bank in China, a fintech company begun by Jack Ma, which looked at trying to support 10 million small, medium-sized enterprises across China through micro loans and immediate responses, so that whole bedrock of the economy would withstand the downturn that's happening. And then finally, on participation, a couple of examples on external engagement, a great organization in Latin America called Mercado, which they did very early on social engagement around how we might social distance, and we're quite creative. And then on collaboration, lots of examples that have flourished recently, but early on in South Africa, mining companies have their own separate hospitals and healthcare facilities, and they work together through the Minerals Council in South Africa to allow that to be shared with the existing national healthcare infrastructure to get ready for the ongoing challenges of the pandemic. So all of those lead us to a place where how we might be assessing the collective response of business. And in some areas around purpose, we're seeing mixed reactions, that there are some strong responses to existing corporate purposes or corporate responsibility or sustainability strategies that are in line, but not fully. And part of that is because many companies that have responded didn't have that core bedrock. And so then it's harder to align that when it's absent. Secondly, there probably hasn't been enough vocal and visible corporate leadership. Again, understandable given the crisis, but bringing the voice of business, especially progressive business, into these conversations is really fundamental as we get into broader debates of how do we leverage stimulus funding, and what direction, what are the underpinning values of what we want to do, and how do we maintain a focus on broader sustainable health as well as short-term economic success. Under performance, things are pretty good around the stakeholder extension, going beyond customers and shareholders and employees to other stakeholders, but there's more work to be done. I think we've all collectively done a really good job in responding through our existing products and services, but the biggest weakness in all of the collective response thus far has been around systemic change, that there's been very few examples early on where initial reactions have bent towards these bigger crises like climate change, like global inequality, that also need to be addressed in tandem with some of these reactions. And on participation, when it comes to engagement and collaboration, relatively positive, strong marks. So the lessons learned from this are that we do want to sustain and continue the collaborative spirit that's been catalyzed by the crisis, but also expand it and be a bit more rigorous and concerted in some of our efforts. We also want to raise the voice of business, have business as a partner at the table to kind of drive these more larger collaborations that will be required to get us through the crisis and recreate and build back better a stronger society. Again, can we think more broadly beyond our narrow stakeholder set to a bigger one, which makes us more impactful? How can we think of changing and facilitating better behavior changes around sustainable and healthy living? Because a lot of that has changed. And finally, how can we make contributions to new growth policies related to the stimulus and the green recovery conversations that are happening, so that we do come back with a stronger, more resilient, and more holistically sustainable society? I'll quickly end with just a trip back in time to the evolution of leadership. And we've been doing a global expert study for 22 years now on sustainable business. And this comes from stakeholders across the world, from business, NGOs, academia, and governments. And we ask them every year, who's a leading company? And last year at this time, we have experts telling us that Unilever, Patagonia, IKEA, Interface, a carpet company of Georgia, and Natura are all among the most striking sustainable leaders in the world. And 37% said Unilever as a leader, 27% said Patagonia. So those two companies retain a very strong part of the mind share among leadership. And the reasons for that relate to having robust strategies, long-term goals, ideally time-bound, having strong CEOs or C-suite executives that speak articulately and passionately about sustainable business, and meet the moment on big dramatic challenges. And if we look at the history, however, there's a really interesting evolution of leadership across the last 20 years, which tells us that we're on the cusp probably of new leadership going forward. So in 97, when we began the study, it was these kinds of companies that articulated best practice leadership and sustainability. Oil companies like BP and Shell, big industrial companies like Dow and DuPont, they were emblematic of leadership because the best idea at the time among sustainability practitioners was to reduce impacts, right? So it's a harm reduction strategy. DuPont's sustainability strategy was called getting to zero. Dow would talk about fewer pounds on the ground, so finding a way to do agriculture with less pesticides. So it was all around identifying material impacts and slowly reducing them over time. And that was best practice. But about a decade later, there was an evolution from just the risk mitigation to finding ways to improve opportunities for the organization. How do we attract more talent? How do we retain talent? How do we identify customer brand opportunities? How do we create new services and products that might fit the challenges of society and drive new revenue streams? And all of this became a need to integrate more parts of the business, which required strategies, and strategies like GE's Eco-Imagination in 2004, or Walmart's 2005 360 sustainability strategy, or Marks and Spencer in the UK, their Plan A strategy, which had over 100 metrics, very comprehensive approach, or Unilever's 2010 launch of their Sustainable Living Plan. These concerted, comprehensive, clear approaches to how they've defined sustainability and then applied it and allowed the rest of the enterprise to be involved were important moments of evolution on leadership. And then we find ourselves now in a different era of leadership that we're calling the purpose-driven era, with a slightly different constellation of companies that reflect leadership, from Danone and IKEA and Natura in Brazil to also Patagonia and Unilever. And these companies have done all of these things, the harm reduction era, created strategies on it, but they've also been able to elevate and mobilize and catalyze through more emotive and values-driven approaches to what business could and should look like, and responding to those sort of needs in much more dramatic fashions and also accessible fashions, internally and externally. And I think to end, we're probably a few years away from a new era of leadership that we call the regenerative era of leadership, which will require us to capitalize and catch up on challenges that we've had in environmental issues, in societal challenges and now in economic inequality issues, and finding businesses to come up with ways to bring us back to a sustainable platform and go beyond makes it a much more complicated and challenging approach to business, but one that's I think within grasp and being foreshadowed by a bunch of companies. So I'll pause there, Shakiba, in case there's any questions we want to get through.
Sure, thanks, Chris. That was, I know we didn't give you a lot of time and there's a ton of content, but that was a really thorough review. Thank you. A great question that's being posed is, can you say a little bit more about the evolution you spoke of from collaboration to shared value?
Yeah, and I think it's these all overlap. So we shouldn't say that these things are completely separate, but the notion of understanding in a crisis or any time in sustainability that we only can do so much ourselves, that there's a little bit of a ceiling to our performance, but finding ways to work with others, solve some of those challenges. And then I think twisting and shifting our core business model more clearly to ways that have multiple benefits. And so that might mean, if we're a food company, ensuring that the food we produce is not only going to be exciting to our customers and drive sales, but also naturally has a stronger nutritional component. So that incremental evolution. And that's a very obvious example, but there's all kinds of examples across the board where there can be work that's done in concert with others in your stakeholder ecosystem that drive your business, but also purposely have the intent of maximizing societal and environmental benefits.
That makes sense. It's a continuum. Okay, great. So over to you, Dr. Dhalla.
Thank you so much, Shakiba, and thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate your thoughts. So I'm going to sort of take us down to more of a follow-up, I think, building on what Chris is saying, but sort of more of a community perspective. So what I'd like to do is sort of talk about some of the trends that we have seen emerging, over the past few weeks as we go through crisis, and what we should perhaps expect coming up. Based on these trends, and then perhaps we can also, talk about some strategies that we might want to think about. So we are seeing reduced income and increased poverty, right? Coming because paychecks are being cut, not as many hours being offered. So many places are being sort of the hospitality and travel industries and restaurants and all kinds of places are seeing a lot of job loss or income loss. There's some increased costs in terms of, what can we purchase that online, and shipping and all that stuff is coming on. Small businesses is trying to make sense of it and survive when there's so many, there's closures and so many rules that are new that are coming out on how you get ready to open up your business. We're also seeing somewhat of an increased oversight, both formal and informal. So, for example, tracking for where the virus is going, monitoring where people are and who's congregating, and so there is an increase in that, and definitely seeing much more increase in our on life, which is the online life. So our expectations of how much time do we spend online. Where is the line between this is my work and this is my home, and where do you cross that over, and how much time do you spend being online, and how do you manage that when you have children and other things. And we see a lot of that in terms of, even in teaching. I've just finished a course and my students are managing their children's education at the same time. But we are seeing an increased dependence on those kinds of technologies. There's also somewhat of a mistrust. There's a rise in that, in terms of, do we trust the information that's coming out, because there's so much of it and it's so confusing. So where do we look for information? So a lot of that is coming up in social media. We're also seeing some, perhaps, as organizations try to survive, businesses try to survive, perhaps it will result in some kind of mistrust. So for example, do I give my money to airlines when they won't, they're not giving out refunds, and they'll hold my money when I need it for other things? Also, am I safe? Can I go out for a walk? Can I go into a store? Can I eat in a restaurant? Can I order takeaway? Like, how safe am I? And then footprint, our footprint, because of our, our interest and our desire to be safe and healthy. So definitely more garbage, right? We're seeing the rise of single-use plastics again, whether they're masks, or gloves, plastic bags. We're no longer bringing in reusable bags or reusable cups. So health and safety issues have certainly started to become visible. In terms of returning practices, more takeout, delivery, drive-throughs, perhaps. Postal services, just reading up that today Canada Post had posted a loss, but perhaps with this new environment, they might have an opportunity to increase their business and step up into that field. Much more of the virtual shopping, right? So many of us are depending on curbside pickups or delivery, and much more disposable stuff, as I talked about, the single-use plastic coming back. Perhaps we'll see more of a need for individual office space. We've gone into, the communal sharing, hot desk approach now to perhaps we are going to think more about the individual office space, commuting by car, perhaps more so than, mass transportation. Garbage. But one thing that we are seeing is a quick change in actions and beliefs, right? We are seeing that we have adopted much more, for example, measures for masking or face covering, social distancing. So we're seeing a real nice increase in how quickly we can change when we have to. So what can we do if we're a business and we're interested in sustainability, but also have all these other issues coming up? What can we do? Well, we can have a look at our packaging, how we package. Can we reuse it? Is there an opportunity for us to find packaging that's less harmful? So other things we can look at is maybe delivery options in terms of, if you look at thinking about a shopping center with all these different stores in there where people go in and shop, can we sort of conceptualize a different kind of approach with perhaps pickup points, which would reduce our footprint as well. Multi-stakeholder, and Chris talked about that, much more of a multi-stakeholder collaboration perhaps, and engagement with our community, and engagement with our our supply chain, and see if we can come up with better options in terms of our production, sustainable production, sustainable consumption opportunities. How do we reduce our physical footprint? Is there a way to share space? Is there a way to figure out another way to collaborate on garbage, and collaborate on plastic, and collaborate on packaging? Which a real, not just for, just sort of looking at energy consumption and water consumption and waste, and where do we put it, and a real opportunity for us to take this time and really dig into issues like that. And then explore our supply chains. How, if we cannot, if the borders are closing up, or perhaps they won't open as easily, if the airline industry changes, if the transportation changes, what happens to our supply chains, and can we figure out a way to modify these? We talk about circularity, and circular economies is making its way into the boardroom and into communities. And in Guelph in particular, we have a big interest in circular economy for food. That has been a large part of our lives recently. Look at transferability opportunities. Can we take our expertise in one thing and then see if we can do something else with it? So we've seen distilleries producing hand sanitizers, and a whole bunch of other innovation in what we can use our existing expertise and existing infrastructure to do something else. In terms of the leadership imperatives, will we have more virtual workplaces? Perhaps Shopify has just announced that they're moving that way. Is there a way for us to do that, or do we need everyone to come to an office? perhaps they don't want to come or don't feel safe to come in, look for beyond profit opportunities, right? Or how else can I contribute or build value that is bigger than profit? Can I look at value in terms of, my contribution to other things that are happening out there in society or for the environment? Are there any practices that that we have that we can transform in terms of how whether we distribution or offering our services or how we deal with our customers and our employees? It's a really good opportunity. We know we can change pretty quickly, so maybe we can use that. This should be a real focus on reputation building, because there is that rising mistrust. So how do we build that reputation, and what kinds of things can I do to build that reputation? Trust is going to be a big deal. Your customers and your employees need to feel that they can trust for their safety, trust that your product is going to do what it says it does, trust that if they give you your money, you will refund it if things don't work out. One thing that I think is going to become real important is to build loyalty for our company, loyalty for our products, loyalty, whether it's through loyalty programs or other things. I think loyalty is going to play a big role in making sure that customers come back, that we are doing the right thing for the environment, we're doing the right thing for the community. And leadership, and we're seeing this in a lot of the the articles that are coming out, words like leading through compassion, leading with kindness, really paying attention to the human part of leadership. So this is kind of all beyond profit. I think I'm going to stop there, and it would be great to engage in some dialogue with our participants at this point.
Thank you, Rumina. Especially the tangible examples that you gave there, I think are really meaningful to businesses. I do have a question directly for you, actually. So the question was, do you see more awareness of values and purpose following the crisis?
In business?
Yes.
You see a lot more. Yes, I would say in my small not being able to go out very much, I see neighborhoods coming together. I see people helping each other. I see, businesses really trying hard to sort of transform so they can contribute to some of the issues that are facing us. So, production of masks and donating those, or PPEs, or, our first responders, like the frontline workers, compassion with grocery store workers, and you really see concern. So I think you see that side, which is giving me a lot of hope. I'm seeing, for example, with our students, where there's a great deal of services and options being offered to our students, right? So I see, I do. I see there's a bit of a change in how we approach business.
That's great. It's good that you see that. And I just remind everyone that's on our call that if you have any questions, to please feel free to pose them in the Q&A. And to note that we will be putting up a final poll for your feedback as well, and to please complete that. Rumina and Chris, feel free to leave your video and mics on. We're going to take some questions. So among other things, what do you think will be the impact of coalitions like business roundtables and others? Maybe I'll start with Chris on this one. So the question is, what do you think will be the impact on coalitions like the business roundtable and others?
I think broadly, the need for greater collaboration, as we've talked about, is accentuated and will be kind of a required part of the skill set that businesses need to do. And it's not easy, right? It's much easier to have a plan, execute, drive it. To do it together with others, especially other non-businesses, so businesses, civil society, government, it's messy, takes time, you got to build trust and all that. But I think it is an indispensable reality, especially if we're going to try and drive some systemic changes that we know are required. I think on the business roundtable specifically, this is an interesting one, because I think there's a growing pushback. And for those who don't know, the business roundtable in the US, kind of the premier big business association, they came out with a strongly worded purpose statement dedicating business towards purpose beyond short-termism, long-termism, and also focusing on stakeholders beyond shareholders. That felt a little bit late, but still it was a big deal because 181 of these large companies signed on to it. There's a growing, I think, scrutiny around how deep that commitment was or is, and how many of those companies have lived up to their purpose. And I think the post-mortem on all of what's happening through this crisis, both with governments and business, will be significant, and there'll be lots of transparency and scrutiny. And so companies that have on one hand taken government money and also invested in buybacks of shares or maintained broad bonuses to some of their executives, that those chickens will come home to roost, and especially in the context of them committing to things like the Business Roundtable's purpose statement. So I think as we go through the crisis and respond, I think we'll have a societal perspective on what is the role of business and a reevaluation of what that is, and the expectations will have grown. And I think we will have two types of companies broadly: those who have gotten it, who responded well, and who are part of society and part of the long-term interest of all of us, and those who have been traditional and selfish and focused more narrowly. And I think that contrast has been brewing for many years, but I think this crisis will accentuate it quite significantly.
That's great feedback. Rumina, anything on that? Or
and then, I think in Canada we have this, this understanding that the corporation must act in the best interest of the corporation. So not just shareholders, but also, the employees and the customers. And I think they're, publicly traded companies anyway. There's an expectation of reporting on, how are you treating your employees? What are you doing in terms of your diversity, those kinds of things. So I think Canadian corporations are sort of going to that, the best interest of the corporation, not just one set of stakeholders. And so I agree with Chris. I think one of the challenges is when you make this aspirational kind of statement saying, we are going to do this, you need to follow through. Right? So you need to be really authentic because otherwise it just becomes an aspirational statement or a public relations move. So I think it'll be interesting to see sort of from when they signed it to what happens as they report coming in the next 12 or 24 months.
That's fair. Thank you. So tell us, is there a way we can use sustainability initiatives to help us recover economically? Are there any specific examples that we could use?
For me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at cost reduction, right? So for example, if you're you're looking for ways to save money, this is a great time to say, how do I reduce my energy use, right? And how do I reduce my my water use, and how do I reduce the amount of garbage so I don't have as many disposals? So you can use some strategies that we know are really effective for the environment, but also really effective in cutting costs. How do I rework my internal operations so that I'm reusing material? We see that a lot in terms of our focus when we started really looking at management systems and what are we doing. So if you are part of a certification program, that's where the focus is. So you can take some of these parameters and say, okay, well, I need to save money. So can I look for ways to save money that are also good for the environment? And I think that's a really good way to start out, sort of looking at what you do.
Chris?
Yeah, I think those are all important points that Rumina brought up. I think the big conversation in Canada, of course, is around the energy transition and what does this mean? And I think this is the political challenge that any government is facing, but this government in particular, of we're in this situation now, we have an opportunity, we need to stimulate the economy and find jobs for people because the mass dislocation that's happened. So how do we do that? How do we take our precious resources and apply them? And do we invest continually in fossil fuel? Or do we take this opportunity to fully take any resources we have and we're going to stimulate something? Let's stimulate renewable energy that can be distributed across the country in many places. And that's a very painful conversation, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But I think there's ways to look at what's happening in Europe on their green recovery stimulus package and apply some of that thinking to address both the adaptation we need to do around climate change, infrastructure development that's required across the country and upgrading and using that thoughtfully, but also in anywhere we can influence and make renewables the easier, better choice. This is the moment, and we should all be demanding that wherever possible as citizens.
That's great. Excellent feedback. I'm going to push both of you a little bit more on that question because we had a great one posed from an audience member who said, but how would you suggest a small or medium-sized business start along the path towards strategic sustainability? Any ideas on first steps or who drives or owns this process? So if we really think about a mom and pop shop, whether it's service industry or product based, what are the first 2-3 things they need to be thinking about on this journey? Maybe Chris, I'll start with you.
Sure, it's a great question. So I think I think it's important to note that there is this evolution of what expectations are around sustainability leadership, which means there's lots of flexibility. So there's not one size fits all. So that's good. That we should all be charting our own ways. I think the first thing is to understand and look at purpose as a framework. Sustainability, there's all kinds of semantics around this, but I think purpose is appealing to many smaller businesses because the foundational definition of purpose is that how you make your money and how you make the world better or make your community better, and that integration of those two things aligns really nicely for any company, and lots of companies have been founded on addressing things like dealing with hygiene. Let's start a soap company, and that has a really positive societal benefit. So every organization can be purposeful, and I think understanding and defining what your purpose is a really valuable and enlightening exercise. And it can be a small organization with 3 people, it can be a bigger organization with 50 people, but having that internal discussion as to what do we stand for, why are we here, what's our highest role, to both be successful as a business and also make a contribution. And that conversation, and sometimes involving your customers or your neighbors in that, can really help you identify some of that higher order opportunities. And from there, that everything else can flow quite easily. I think the next step is to identify some of the low-hanging fruit that Rumina was talking about a little bit on. How do we be more efficient? How do we be more effective on some of our impacts? And usually there are cost savings, right? Any environmental impact from energy or water use or waste, those are opportunities to reduce our costs and be really smart and effective. So that's easy and exciting and should drive us. And the second part of it is, how do we think of broader societal contributions, both with our employees and with wherever we're operating with our customers, and what are the 1 or 2 places where we can dig in and begin to experiment. I don't think you need to go beyond that in the initial stages, but I think unlocking that purposeful journey, however short term, and then reflecting upon it after a year, will have this, I think, virtuous circle of motivation and mobilization, and also the rewards, because customers want purposeful organizations, employees want to work with purposeful organizations, regulators look favorably upon purposeful organizations. I'm sure the Chamber of Commerce wants other companies to have a purpose beyond just making short-term profit. So all of those things reinforce themselves into a longer-term successful business strategy.
That's excellent feedback. Rumina, did you want to add?
Just, one easy way that works for me anyway on an individual basis, and perhaps, a small business might benefit from, is sort of pay attention. We are on the P journey today, so just going to use people, planet, and profit. How am I contributing to my community, to society? How does this impact my profit, and how does this help my planet? And if you can sort of eyeball that every time you make a decision, I think that sort of, and get your employees excited about it, and use that as a sort of an understanding on everything, evaluating the decisions you make, whether it's supplying or production, or how you treat people, or what you do for your community. I think that gives you a really nice framework to just start sort of, on that journey. Everybody's responsibility, but the champion leads the way, really. So find a champion.
I mean, it was really nice to see from the survey, the poll we just did before you started, that so many folks are actually, there's an increased interest in sustainability, all things considered.
Absolutely.
So actually leads to the next question, which is, so then what skills would you say that sustainability leaders need as they come out of this crisis? Rumina, did you want to start?
Well, I think a long-term perspective, a longer term than your short-term quarterly perspective. I think having a vision, exciting, people around you, leading by example, leading sort of with a lot of compassion and kindness, and being authentic. Don't say we are environmentally responsible and then your action does not, so greenwashing is it's very easy to sort of get into that kind of stuff. It becomes a public relations. So really have, for me, vision and authenticity around how you do it. Having, as Chris said, having a purpose and really following through on that purpose in everything you do and wherever you allocate resources. So that would be sort of my thinking. I'm sure Chris have other examples.
That's great, Chris.
I think those are great, Rumina. And I think to build on those, I would add, we talked about collaboration quite a bit. So I think being able to work well with others and collaborate, which is again, it's difficult, to play nicely in the sandbox requires compromise and listening and patience and working through things like that. So that's a critical skill that needs to be developed. I think in addition to the authenticity and long-termism, Rumina, I think, which is exactly right, courage too is also another key attribute. How do we not only respond to the existing here and now, which is fundamental, but how can we look a little bit more deeply into the future and with a strong set of values work towards and fight for that future that's better for all going forward. And that's hard. It's hard to be a pioneer in some of these things for organizations and business leaders, especially when we're in a difficult situation and surviving. So it does take a lot of courage and fortitude to do that. I think systemic thinking is also part of this, right? That, sustainability fundamentally is about three pillars. There's an economic part of sustainability, there's an environmental, and there's a social. And being able to understand the interactions between those and how all of those interact with the broader ecosystem of stakeholders is tricky. It's complicated, but it's wonderfully rich and something to jump into.
Well, that's great. And I like that you brought up the systemic piece, because I think there is something to be said about that. Kind of two parts there, Chris. How does a business get involved in impacting systemic change? And then further, we talked a lot about trust and strengthening that trust. What role does government have in building that trust and also therefore in the systemic change that is required? It's a loaded question, but in a couple of minutes, what can you say about that?
Well, I think so. It's a good question. So I think systemic change has a couple of dimensions. One of them is trying to change the rules of the game, which has a governmental component. We do need good regulations, smart regulations, and shifting incentives that taxes and sometimes punitive regulatory regimes can influence. So we want to try and understand those and influence those rules, because once they do that, then everything changes, right? It's not one or two companies that are standout doing remarkable things. All boats are lifted or forced to be lifted that way. So understanding government affairs and being able to be at the table and influence and lobby for the proper kind of changes that lead to broader sustainable outcomes is really fundamental. I think that's one piece of it. Doing that on your own is also difficult. So again, working together with associations allows us to come with a more forceful voice and a more legitimate voice. Doing that ideally together with NGOs and academia and with scientific basis adds that oomph to try and drive those systemic conversations. So all of those things are in play. And then for the governmental role, I mean, government's going to be in a has been in a very difficult situation, and I think it's been easy to dismiss government on some of these issues, but in many ways governments have been forced to think more short term, even ironically, than businesses, which is the antithesis of sustainable thinking, right? We can only be things only make sense when we stretch the time horizon, and in 10 years anything's possible. If we're talking about next quarter, everything locks down, or it's very difficult to change. And governments, I think, are increasingly in that situation. So we need to provide cover and support and pressure on governments to allow them to do the right thing in the long-term interest, which is very difficult. But the more dialogue, more engagement, more forums to have that conversation opens up people's ability to act, I think, with more thoughtful long-termism.
Thanks, Chris. Rumina?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. What can I say? I mean, that was. I just really want to give you an example of how quickly government can change the trust dynamic, right? So airlines at the moment, I mean, the government says we support the airlines. We don't want them to go under. So we are, so there's no push to give refunds as there has been in other countries. What happens to the trust between the airline and the passenger? That can shift, right? So government can totally influence how we perceive. Same goes for the financial services industries or the car manufacturers. Trust can shift depending on what the government does. So yeah, absolutely, government. If we can influence that change, I think that will be really, really powerful.
Great. So I had a great question asked about whether or not you could share an inspiring success story based on your experience and time. And someone else asked, I believe they noticed, it may have been the company interface, Chris, in your slides, that kind of lasted through the 3 eras of leadership. So perhaps you could use that as an example, but I'll leave it to both of you to talk about a success story. Chris, do you want to start?
So it's a great observation that Interface is that company, and it's a small company. It's $1 billion company, so it's bigger than small businesses, but it's not a massive global company. They're the biggest commercial carpet company in the world, however, so they're important in their industry. And their journey, and if people haven't looked at their journey, and Ray Anderson, their founder in particular, there's some wonderful, inspiring, very progressive and modern takes on sustainable business. He is arguably the founder of the circular economy concept. But his story is amazing because he had this epiphanous moment where he realized that industrial carpets are very fossil fuel intensive and very wasteful, and he realized he thought he was a plunderer of the earth, and he wanted to kind of transition that and create a circular model and climb Mount Sustainability as he phrased it. And that organization was important back in the Do No Harm era because they created this Get to Zero. And mission zero was zero carbon, zero waste, completely integrated recycling of waste and things like that. They also evolved into their mission zero strategy in the next era and kind of led the way on what that looks like. And then the more recent purposeful driven era, their advocacy strategy relates to their purpose, which is to help industry love the world. So they view themselves as a demonstrator of how business can be integrated with a more sustainable planet. And their take climate back advocacy position has all been meant to, let's not talk about reducing greenhouse gases, let's talk about reversing climate change. And they view themselves as a little company that could. So it's a very dynamic, responsive organization. One of the reasons why they've been so responsive is because the founder, who passed away in 2012, has this extraordinary legacy, but also because they have this dream team of extraordinarily world thinkers on sustainability, which has been with them for 20 years, advising and pushing them into a place of more ambition. So it's a great case study.
That's great. Thank you. Rumina, do you have an example?
Yes, I mean, luckily there are so many good examples out there. Now, when I first started teaching in this field, you had to sort of really look for them, and Interface was one we used, but so many examples, whether it's, a company like Unilever, where they're trying really hard to make sure their entire supply chains are sustainable, the products are sustainable. They also produce products that impact, that are really useful for those at the base of the pyramid who don't have a lot of, they don't have a lot of income to be able to buy big volumes like we can, and not, so they're really paying attention to who their customer is. So we have, the Unilevers of the world. We also see a lot more of the buy one, give one model of operations. We see benefits corporations, Danone Canada, for example, is a benefit corporation. So more and more and more, we see companies are doing this, and it's really good for their business. IKEA, for example, loads of companies, and you see them starting to get recognized individually in the communities, but also on a global scale. So yeah, luckily we have lots of examples to talk about.
And there's some great Canadian examples. If I could just, I think there's some amazing companies like Maple Leaf Foods, which has identified a purpose of raise the good in food, but also a vision of being the most sustainable protein company on the planet, which has led them into plant-based foods and insects, and also extraordinary animal welfare things. And driven by a very ambitious and forthright CEO and a really good sound strategy to drive it forward. So that's impressive. I think the banks are all moving towards something more interesting. I think TD's ready commitment is really timely given the COVID crisis and what they've been trying to do of move citizenship and sustainability to something more forthright. I think companies like Nutrien in Saskatchewan are also focused more deeply on sustainable agriculture and how they can. So there's lots of fantastic Canadian examples are in line with all these other world-class ones that are just coming up and popping.
And if I could just add to that, proud chamber member and favorite spot, of course, our local neighborhood Willie, the neighborhood group here in Guelph with multiple restaurants. You know, they really have championed that zero waste approach, and in both the way that they pay their staff, that they procure their food supply, and what they do and how they limit waste, for an example. So it is possible to do this work at that size of a business, as well as the Unilevers and Interfaces of the world. So that's excellent. Well, I want to thank you both very much for joining us today. It was a really insightful conversation, and I'm really grateful for your expertise. I want to thank everyone who was participating and engaging in the conversation and asking such excellent questions. Just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted on the Lang School's YouTube channel for future reference. Also, the panelists, thank you. You will be providing the PowerPoint presentations, and we'll send that to you after the conclusion of this webinar. And finally, our final webinar of the series, we will be discussing how the tourism industry can rebound and be rebuilt after the pandemic and economic shutdown. We'll be featuring Lang School's Dr. Marian Jopa and Lisa Lavecchia, President and CEO of Destination Ontario. So thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Shakiba. Thank you. Bye.